fundamental faith in the fairness of our institutions and our government would deteriorate. Speaking of the slick and the clever, by 1970, Alan Greenspan was a millionaire. By then, he owned an apartment at United Nations Plaza, which was a very fashionable address, which he shared with other famous people. Actually, he wasn't famous at this point, but Walter Cronkite, Truman Capote, Johnny Carson. But what he had done, that is, as an economist, to live up to this, to live up to living with such company, it really isn't clear. He wasn't important. Those who respected him said he was a whiz with numbers, but a larger group remembers that he was full of numbers, but he was also always wrong. In the words of biographer Justin Martin, the general impression among people who knew Greenspan in those days was that he wasn't exactly marked for greatness. His old friends were destined to watch his career unfold. Nixon advisor, Ford advisor, 5-time Fed chief, in stunned amazement. Another to witness the curious elevation of Alan Greenspan was Mark Farber, when he arrived in Wall Street with White Weld in 1970. His job was to attend the monthly economic presentations by Greenspan and interpret the comments for the overseas offices. And now I'm quoting from Mark. This was in the Gloom, Boom, and Doom report a couple of years ago. Looking back, I had no idea what Mr. Greenspan was talking about. But I may not have been the exception. When Mr. Greenspan first came on board at White Weld as a consultant, 30 or 40 people from the firm's various departments would attend the meetings. Within a few months, however, attendance had dropped to just a handful. By then, I had also learned that the easiest way for me to communicate to me, incomprehensible remarks was simply to summarize the previous day's news from the front page of the Wall Street Journal. And then Mark noted that one of the best investment decisions White Weld ever made was to get rid of Mr. Greenspan in late 1972 and hire Gary Schilling. Now, Martin Mayer, who's written a number of books about Wall Street and who first met Greenspan in the 1960s, wrote that the millionaire economist was making a specialty of statistical espionage, which were Greenspan's words. And Mayer, in a book, wrote that the book on him, book on Greenspan, was that you could order the opinion you needed. Greenspan's girlfriend, Barbara Walters, wrote in her recent autobiography how Alan Greenspan, a man who believed in the philosophy of little government interference and few rules or regulations, could end up becoming chairman of the greatest regulatory agent in the world is beyond me. Now, here we have Alan Greenspan. This was his road to success. He would do anything and he would say anything. He worked his relations with the press much harder than he ever worked as an economist or for his clients. He went one step further than other fast-track economists. He dated the press, and then finally he married it. Even though he was a minor figure in the 1960s, he was getting his name in the New York Times, making market predictions. The funny thing is that he was always the bear in the article during a decade when the market was going up. Then in the 70s, he was always wrong, too, because he was always bullish and the market was always going down. And now William Martin's insight that a spiral of mounting prices and wages seeks more and more financing and a considerable volume of the expenditure financed at all times out of borrowed funds was a feature of the 1960s. That was a decade of the conglomerate. And some who built mountains from molehills in the 50s and 60s were Meshullam Rickless, Carl Lindner, and Saul Steinberg. They used paper instead of cash to buy companies. And as all of these things go, it ended in a baleful scrap heap of waste with such absurdities as Mary Carter Paint attempting to swallow Pan American Airlines, which failed, and then just about everything went down the drain at the same time, although these three didn't. It's not a coincidence that the American living standard probably peaked around 1970 when capital was so badly mishandled. And then in the 70s, with inflation, it, of course, was even more poorly handled. Now, on June 28, 1978, Federal Reserve Board member Henry C. Wallach addressed the gathering seniors at Fordham University at their commencement. Inflation, he informed the graduates, is a means by which the strong can more effectively exploit the weak. The strategically positioned and well-organized can gain at the expense of the unorganized and the aged. It was at that point that Every graduating senior from Fordham University ran for the exits for the closest Goldman Sachs recruiting booth. But the parents were still behind. And Wallach explained that inflation is technically an economic problem. I mean the breakdown of our standards of measuring economic values as a consequence of inflation. The strong are smart enough to understand that inflation introduces an element of deceit in our economic dealings. Contracts are no longer made to be kept in terms of constant values, but one party understands this better than the other. Wallach went on to emphasize that the increasing uncertainty in providing privately for the future pushes people who are seeking security towards the government. He also said, I don't have the quote here, but it was something like the mark of a civilized country is that the people are able to provide for themselves and not get pushed towards the government to provide for them. Moving forward to the 1980s, we had the savings and loan free-for-all. We were adding mounds of debt that would have been inconceivable to Martin back in 1957. In 1980, we, the United States, borrowed $1.40 for every $1 we added to the GNP back then. By 1985, we were adding $4 for every $1 of GDP. Savings and loans were the perfect instrument for clever operators. S&L deposits were insured by the government, and the S&Ls had been deregulated. In the wrong hands, the S&Ls were sponges for questionable investments. Now, Mechelem Rickless, Carl Lindner, Saul Steinberg used their conglomerate platforms to swap paper. Now, in the 1980s, Barry Wigmore, who was a partner at Goldman Sachs at the time, wrote an excellent book, Security Markets of the 1980s, and in it he wrote of Rickless, Lindner, and Steinberg, it is tempting to conclude that they represented a cabal. They cooperated and invested with each other extensively and were old hands in the market aspect of Chinese paper from the merger wave of the 1960s. Their activities illustrate the combination of native cunning and access to leverage that made them so effective. Wigmore wrote of the three, they had a common involvement with Michael Milken's group at Drexel Burnham that probably helped to create enough liquidity for the junk bond securities. Now, William Seidman headed the Resolution Trust Corporation, which worked out the savings and loan problems. And of the S&L mess, Seidman wrote later that Michael Milken had rigged the market by operating a sort of daisy chain among S&Ls to trade the bonds back and forth across his famous X-shaped desk in Los Angeles. By manipulating the market, he maintained the facade that the bonds were trading at genuine market prices. In 1984, Alan Greenspan was hired by the most notorious criminal in the savings and loan racket. That was Charles Keating. Keating laundered money through Lincoln Savings and Loan. He needed someone to write a letter to his regulator, the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, that stated Lincoln Savings and Loan investments were sound. In 1985, Greenspan wrote to the Federal Home Loan Bank that Lincoln's management, these are Greenspan's words now, is seasoned and expert in selecting and making direct investments. Now, by that time, Lincoln was not only loaded up with deals through Milken, it was swapping them at a profit through its holding company, American Continental Corporation, ACC, and Charles Keating. Both of them had been spun out of Carl Lindner's American Financial Corporation. Keating was known as Lindner's hatchet man. Now, Greenspan surely knew who he was dealing with. It's what everybody knew was going on at that point. He had been on Wall Street in the 1960s. He trafficked in knowing who he should be schmoozing. In the 1980s, he must have known that Lincoln was part of the Rickless, Steinberg, Lindner, Boesky, Milken crowd that was trading securities back and forth and making paper profits. This was just the man to inherit the Federal Reserve chairmanship in 1987. 4 years before, in 1983, a poll of Wall Street executives found that 31% of them had a special confidence in Alan Greenspan should he be named chairman. He was second in the poll behind Paul Volcker. Greenspan's hearing for Federal Reserve chairman was in August 1987. Senator William Proxmire, a Democrat from Wisconsin, was the chairman. He didn't like Greenspan. He had voted against Greenspan's confirmation as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in 1974 because he thought Greenspan would pass information back to the companies with whom he had consulted. This seems like quite a suspicion, and I'm not sure why he thought that, but I suspect that he knew of Greenspan's reputation. He probably had asked around, that the book on him was that you could order the opinion you needed. More than Greenspan's habit of always being wrong, and by such a wide